Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
So, here's the thing. Up until a month ago, I thought I had a pretty normal family. My mom, my dad, and my older brother, Jake. Sure, we had our ups and downs like everyone else, but nothing crazy. That all changed one night when I overheard my mom on the phone, whispering to someone just outside my room. It was around midnight, and I wasn't even trying to eavesdrop. I was half asleep, but the tone of her voice snapped me awake. Jake doesn't know, and neither does my name. It'll ruin everything, she hissed, her voice urgent but low. I froze. What didn't Jake and I know? What would ruin everything? At first, I thought it had to be something mundane. Maybe money problems or a family argument they didn't want us to know about. My parents could be secretive, but nothing had ever felt sinister. Still, something about the way she said it gave me this heavy, twisting feeling in my gut, like whatever it was would change everything. I debated confronting her about it right then and there, but I chickened out. I told myself I was probably reading too much into it. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. My mom was acting totally normal, making pancakes like she always did on Saturdays, but I couldn't shake the pit in my stomach. Every time I looked at her, I wondered who she was talking to. My dad? Someone else? And why bring up Jake and me specifically? A few days passed, and I tried to put it out of my head, but things only got weirder. Jake came home from college for the weekend, and suddenly, the whole vibe in the house shifted. My mom was on edge, snapping at the littlest things, and my dad barely said two words to anyone. Jake even noticed. What's going on with them? He asked me while we were sitting in the living room. I shrugged, trying to act casual. I dunno. They've been weird all week. Jake raised an eyebrow. Weird how? I hesitated. I wanted to tell him about what I'd overheard, but I wasn't sure if I should. What if it was nothing? Or worse, what if it wasn't nothing? I don't know, I said finally. Mom's just been tense, I guess. Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. It's probably just Dad. You know how he gets when work stresses him out. I nodded, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. My dad's been stressed plenty of times, but this wasn't his usual quiet brooding. This felt deliberate, like he was avoiding something, or someone. The breaking point came that Sunday morning. Jake and I were sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through our phones, while my mom bustled around making coffee. My dad walked in, already dressed for work even though it was the weekend. He muttered a quick, morning, but didn't stop to chat like he normally would. Jake frowned. Where are you going? It's Sunday. Just have some things to take care of at the office, my dad said without looking up. My mom glanced at him, her hand tightening. You didn't mention that last night. I didn't think I needed to. He shot back, his tone sharp. The tension in the room was palpable. Jake and I exchanged a look, and I could tell he was just as confused as I was. My dad grabbed his car keys and left without another word, the front door slamming behind him. What the hell was that about? Jake asked, looking at my mom. She waved him off, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. He's just busy, that's all. Don't worry about it. Jake wasn't buying it. Mom, seriously, is something going on? My mom's face tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell us. But then she forced another smile and said, nothing you two need to worry about. Jake rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but I couldn't let it go. I wanted answers, and I was done waiting for someone to hand them to me. That night, while everyone was asleep, I started snooping. It felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something huge they weren't telling us. I started with my mom's phone, but it was locked, and I didn't dare try guessing the passcode. So I moved on to my dad's office, figuring I might find something there. His desk drawers were filled with the usual stuff: pins, paper clips, receipts. But in the bottom drawer, I found a manila folder labeled private. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside, there were a bunch of papers, legal documents, from the looks of it. Most of it didn't make sense to me, but one thing stood out: a letter from someone named E. Wilson. It wasn't long, but the words practically jumped off the page. David, I don't care what you or your wife think is best. Jake deserves to know the truth about where he came from. I've stayed quiet for 21 years, but I won't anymore. He's my son too. I stared at the letter, my hands shaking. Jake's son too? What did that even mean? Was it a mistake? A misunderstanding? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The pieces started to click together. The phone call, the weird tension, my mom's panicked reaction to Jake coming home. This wasn't just some family drama. This was a secret, a big one. And somehow, Jake and I were right in the middle of it. It all started when my mom decided to tackle what she called the attic apocalypse. It wasn't unusual for her to dive into random cleaning frenzies when she was stressed, and after how weird she'd been acting since Jake came home, I figured this was her way of keeping busy. I wasn't exactly thrilled to help, but she insisted. "Come on," she said, waving a flashlight at me. "You're good at organizing. Plus, some of this stuff might be yours." The attic was a disaster. Boxes piled on top of each other, half-empty bins spilling Christmas decorations and old clothes. I sneezed about a dozen times in the first 10 minutes, but I pushed through. Most of it was boring. School projects from when I was a kid, old photo albums, random knickknacks my parents hadn't looked at in years. But then I found it. A beat-up cardboard box shoved into a corner behind a pile of old suitcases. The label, scrawled in thick black marker, read, "Summer 1999. I froze when I saw the date. That was the year Jake was born. I figured it'd be baby stuff, pictures, hospital bracelets, that kind of thing. But when I opened the box, the first thing I saw wasn't photos or keepsakes. It was a stack of envelopes tied together with twine. The handwriting on the envelopes was neat and feminine, and they were all addressed to my dad. The return address at the top left corner said, E. Wilson. My heart started racing. Who was E. Wilson? Why was she writing to my dad in 1999? I reached for one of the letters, but before I could open it, my mom's voice cut through the dusty air like a knife. "What are you doing?" I whipped around, clutching the letter like a kid caught stealing cookies from the jar. My mom stood at the top of the attic stairs, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the box in front of me. Just looking," I stammered. "Is this Jake's baby stuff?" She crossed the room in 2 quick strides and snatched the letter out of my hand. "This is private," she snapped, shoving the stack of envelopes back into the box and slamming the lid shut. She grabbed the box and shoved it into the darkest corner of the attic, as far out of reach as possible. "Mom, who's E. Wilson?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Her jaw tightened, but she forced a thin smile. "No one you need to worry about." I stared at her, my mind spinning. She looked nervous, more nervous than I'd ever seen her. "Is it, like, a friend of Dad's or something?" She shook her head and started backing toward the stairs. "It doesn't matter. Just leave it alone, okay?" And with that, she was gone, leaving me standing there with more questions than ever. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the box, or the way my mom had freaked out when she saw me holding the letter. It was so unlike her. She's always been the type to laugh off stuff like this, brushing it aside as no big deal. But this had her rattled. I waited until everyone was asleep before making my move. I tiptoed up to the attic, using the light on my phone to guide me. The box was exactly where she'd shoved it earlier, hidden behind the suitcases. I pulled it out, sat down on the dusty floor, and untied the stack of envelopes. The first letter hit me like a truck. It was dated May 1999, just a couple of months before Jake was born. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, and the tone was intimate. "David, I can't stop thinking about you. The way you looked at me last weekend, like I was the only person in the room. I know this isn't right. I know we're hurting people by doing this, but I can't help myself. I love you. I don't care what anyone thinks. I want to be with you, no matter what." The signature at the bottom read, "Elena." I stared at the letter, my hands shaking. My dad had been having an affair. I reached for the next letter and the next, reading them one after another. They weren't just random notes. They were love letters. Detailed, emotional, desperate love letters from someone who clearly believed she and my dad were meant to be together. The last letter in the stack was different. It wasn't romantic. It was angry. "David, I don't understand how you can just walk away like this. You said you loved me. You said we'd figure it out. But now you're telling me to let it go? What about the baby? What about everything we talked about? You can't just pretend this never happened." "The baby." My stomach twisted. She was talking about Jake. She had to be. I tried to tell myself I was jumping to conclusions, but all the pieces were lining up. My dad had been having an affair with this Elena woman, and Jake was born right in the middle of it. The next morning, I couldn't look at my dad without hearing Elena's words in my head. "What about the baby?" I kept sneaking glances at Jake, wondering if he knew, if he even suspected. But he seemed totally normal, cracking jokes about the awful instant coffee my mom always buys and scrolling through his phone like nothing had changed. "Hey," Jake said, nudging me with his elbow. "You're quiet. What's up?" "Nothing," I mumbled, poking at my cereal. "Liar." He gave me a teasing grin, but I couldn't even fake a smile back. My brain was too busy spinning, trying to figure out what to do. Should I tell Jake? Should I confront my parents? Later that afternoon, I caught my mom alone in the kitchen. I wasn't planning on saying anything, but the words just spilled out. Mom, who's Elena? Her hand froze mid-stir over the pot of soup she was making. What? Elena, I repeated. I saw the letters. Her face went white. You shouldn't have been snooping. Don't turn this around on me, I snapped. Who is she? Was Dad? Was he cheating on you when Jake was born? She turned off the burner and set the spoon down, her shoulders slumping like she'd been carrying this weight for years. It's not what you think, she said quietly. Then what is it? She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Finally, she just shook her head. It's complicated. Please, just drop it. For your own sake. But I couldn't drop it. Not now. Not after everything I'd read. Because deep down, I knew the truth. My dad's affair wasn't just some old skeleton in the closet. It was a ticking time bomb, and sooner or later, it was going to explode. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The weight of what I'd found in the attic, the letters, the implications, sat heavy in my chest. I spent most of breakfast trying to act normal, but I must have looked off, because Jake kept glancing at me like he was trying to figure out what was going on. Hey, you good? He asked casually, pouring himself another cup of coffee. Yeah, fine, I said, a little too quickly. I stared into my cereal bowl, avoiding eye contact. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. Okay, if you say so. He leaned against the counter, stirring his coffee. You're acting weird, though. I could feel the words bubbling up. Jake, I think you're not who you think you are. I think Dad cheated on Mom, and your real mom might be someone named Elena. But just as I was about to open my mouth, my mom walked into the kitchen. The look she gave me stopped me cold. It wasn't angry exactly, but it was sharp, almost like a warning. Like she could sense I was about to spill something, and she wasn't having it. Good morning, boys, she said, smiling just enough to seem pleasant. Morning, Jake said, oblivious. But I could barely choke out a reply. My mom didn't even glance in my direction. She went straight to the fridge, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. But I knew better. She knew. The tension hung in the air like a cloud. Jake shrugged it off and left the kitchen, muttering something about meeting up with his old high school friends. The second he was out the door, my mom turned to me. We need to talk. I followed her into the living room, my heart pounding. She sat down on the couch and gestured for me to sit too, but I stayed standing. I didn't want to feel cornered. I know you went through the box, she said, folding her hands in her lap. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like she was trying to keep her anger in check. You didn't exactly leave me a choice, I said, crossing my arms. What was I supposed to think after how you freaked out yesterday? She sighed, rubbing her temples. That box, those letters, they're from a long time ago. It's in the past, okay? It doesn't matter anymore. Doesn't matter? I said, my voice rising. Mom, Dad was having an affair. And this Elena woman, she was talking about a baby. Was she talking about Jake? Her face went pale. For a second, she looked like she might actually answer me. But then she shook her head. It's complicated, she said, the same phrase she'd used the night before. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. I snapped. Because right now, it feels like our entire family is built on a lie. Her expression hardened. This isn't your business, okay? You don't know the full story, and frankly, you don't need to. That's bullsh. I stopped myself just in time. If it's not my business, then why did you freak out so much when I found the letters? Why are you still so scared if it's all in the past? She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her jaw clenched, like she was trying to decide how much to say. Finally, she let out a long breath. It would tear this family apart, she said softly. If Jake or your father found out, it would destroy everything. That should have been the end of it. I should have let it go, but I couldn't. Not when there was so much she wasn't telling me. Later that afternoon, while Jake was out with his friends, I cornered my mom again. I'm not dropping this, I said firmly. I know there's more to the story. You have to tell me the truth. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes tired, like she'd been carrying this secret for years. It's not what you think, she said finally. Your dad and I, we've made mistakes, okay? But we've always done what we thought was best for this family. That doesn't answer my question, I said, my voice sharp. Is Jake even your son? Her breath hitched. It was subtle, but I caught it. Of course he's my son, she said quickly. Too quickly. Biologically. I pressed. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But then she shook her head. I can't do this right now, she muttered, getting up and walking toward the stairs. Mom, wait, I said, following her. What did you mean when you said, it's not like Jake knows where he came from? What does that even mean? She froze on the staircase, her back to me. I could see her shoulders tense, her hands gripping the railing. I shouldn't have said that, she said quietly. Forget I said it. Forget it? I repeated, my voice shaking. How am I supposed to forget something like that? You're hiding something, and I have a right to know what it is. She didn't respond. She just walked upstairs and shut the bedroom door behind her. I spent the rest of the day trying to piece everything together, but the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. If Jake wasn't my mom's biological son, then whose son was he? Was Elena his real mom? And if so, did Jake know? Did my dad know that I knew? That night, I decided to test the waters. Jake and I were sitting on the couch, half watching a movie, when I turned to him and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about doing one of those ancestry DNA kits?" He gave me a weird look. What, like the ones that tell you if you're part Viking or something? Yeah, I said, trying to sound casual. It could be cool, right? To see where we come from. He shrugged. I guess. But we already know where we come from. Mom's side is Italian. Dad's side is, what? Irish? Scottish. I corrected automatically. Whatever, he said, laughing. Why? Are you trying to find out if we're secretly royalty or something? I forced a laugh, but my stomach was in knots. He had no idea. As Jake went back to watching the movie, I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to get to the bottom of this. No matter what it took, I was going to find out the truth. And if my mom wouldn't tell me, I'd find someone who would. After my mom's cryptic comment and the avalanche of doubts it unleashed, I couldn't let it go. Her words, "It's not like Jake knows where he came from," were on a loop in my head. The letters from Elena, the baby she mentioned, the tension in the house every time Jake was around. It all felt connected, but I didn't have the full picture. And the longer I went without answers, the more it ate at me. So, I came up with a plan. If my parents wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. That's how I ended up on my laptop late one night, ordering 2 Ancestry DNA kits. My hands were shaking as I clicked Confirm Purchase, but I felt a weird sense of relief, like I was finally taking control of the situation. The hard part was convincing Jake. He came back from a night out with friends, flopped onto the couch, and grabbed a slice of leftover pizza. I decided to strike while he was in a good mood. Hey, I was thinking, I started, sitting down next to him. You know those DNA kits? The ones that tell you where your ancestors are from? Jake gave me a sideways look, mid-bite. Yeah? What about them? I ordered a couple, I said, trying to sound casual. Figured it'd be fun to see if there's anything surprising in our family tree. Like, what if we're related to royalty or something? He laughed. Yeah, right? More like we're related to a long line of farmers and factory workers. Maybe, I said, shrugging. But who knows? Could be cool to find out, though, right? He hesitated for a second, then nodded. Sure, why not? Beats watching another true crime documentary. The kits arrived a few days later. I handed one to Jake, trying to ignore the nerves twisting in my stomach. He didn't think twice about it. He swabbed his cheek, sealed the sample, and tossed it in the prepaid envelope like it was no big deal. I did mine too, just to keep the ruse going. But my mind was racing the whole time. The waiting was torture. I checked my email obsessively, refreshing the page every few hours, even though I knew the results wouldn't come in for weeks. Every time Jake talked about school, or joked about something dumb our parents did, I felt this pang of guilt. He had no idea I was digging into something that could change everything. When the email finally came, my heart practically stopped. I locked myself in my room, sat on my bed, and opened the results. At first, it was all generic stuff, percentages of different ethnicities, migration patterns, blah blah blah. Then I saw it, DNA relatives. There it was, clear as day. Jake was listed as my half-brother. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Half-brother. Not full sibling, half. My brain went into overdrive, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mistake? Maybe the test was wrong? But the more I thought about it, the more it added up. The letters, my mom's reaction, the name Elena, I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just some family secret. They lied to both of us. Jake wasn't my full brother, which meant one of my parents wasn't biologically related to him. And considering the timing, the letters, and everything else, it wasn't hard to guess who. I couldn't tell Jake. Not yet. He didn't deserve to have his world turned upside down because of something I wasn't even sure I fully understood. But I couldn't sit on it either. I needed more answers. That night, I decided to confront my dad. I waited until after dinner, when when he was alone in the living room watching TV. I walked in, trying to act normal, but my pulse was pounding in my ears. "Hey, can we talk?" I asked, standing awkwardly by the doorway. He muted the TV and turned to me. "Sure. What's up?" I sat down on the edge of the couch, gripping my phone so hard I thought I might crack the screen. "I found something weird," I said carefully. "About Jake." He stiffened, his expression shifting from casual to cautious in an instant. "What do you mean?" I got one of those DNA kits," I said, watching his reaction closely. "Jake did it too. For fun." For a split second, I saw panic flash across his face. He quickly masked it, but it was too late. I'd already seen it. "What do you mean, weird?" he asked, his voice too calm. "It says we're half-siblings," I said bluntly. The room went silent. My dad stared at me, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrest. Finally, he let out a long sigh and leaned back in his chair. "I was hoping this day wouldn't come," he said quietly. "So it's true," I said, my voice shaking. "Jake's not really my brother." "He is your brother," my dad said quickly. "In every way that matters. Biologically," I pressed. "He's not my full brother, is he?" My dad ran a hand through his hair, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "No," he admitted. "He's not." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Even though I'd already suspected it, hearing him say it out loud made it real. "So who's his mom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated, then said, "Her name was Elena." The room felt like it was spinning. "Was?" I asked. "She passed away a long time ago," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Before Jake even started school." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing with a million questions. Why hadn't he told Jake the truth? Why had they lied to me? To us? Why didn't you tell us? I asked finally. Why keep it a secret? My dad sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Because it wasn't just about me. Your mom. She agreed to raise Jake as her own, but it wasn't easy for her. She wanted to protect him. Protect you. We thought it was best if no one knew." "Best for who?" I shot back, my voice shaking. "Because it sure as hell wasn't best for Jake." He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, looking like the weight of the secret was finally crushing him. I left the room without another word. My dad's confession had answered some questions, but it had opened up even more. If Elena was Jake's mom, why had she disappeared from his life? What had really happened between her and my parents? And most importantly, how was I supposed to keep this secret from Jake when it felt like the truth was about to tear our entire family apart? I knew confronting my dad in the garage wasn't going to be easy. He's not exactly the type to wear his emotions on his sleeve, let alone dive into a conversation about something this heavy. But after the DNA results and his slip during our last talk, I couldn't let it go. I needed the full truth, no matter how ugly it was. I waited until I heard him tinkering with something in the garage, his usual Saturday routine. He was bent over his workbench, tightening a bolt on a rusty old bike he'd been meaning to fix for years. I stood in the doorway for a minute, working up the courage to speak. "Dad," I said finally. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression neutral. "Yeah, we need to talk." Something in my tone must have tipped him off because he stopped what he was doing and turned to face me fully. "About what?" "Elena," I said, my voice steady. His face froze for half a second, then he furrowed his brows like he was confused. "Who?" "Don't," I snapped, stepping further into the garage. "I know about the letters. I know about her. And I know Jake isn't my full brother." For a moment, he just stared at me, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his voice low. "Yes, I do." I shot back. "I read the letters. I did a DNA test with Jake. It says we're half-siblings. So stop lying to me." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked older, defeated. "I don't know why you do something like that," he said, shaking his head. "You shouldn't have." "Just tell me the truth," I interrupted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Who is Elena? Is she Jake's real mom?" The silence was suffocating. My dad rubbed his temples like he was trying to buy time, but I wasn't going to let him off the hook. Finally, he let out a long sigh. "Yes," he said quietly. My stomach dropped, even though I'd already suspected it. Hearing him say it out loud made it real. "So what?" I demanded. "You had an affair? And then what? Mom just agreed to raise Jake like nothing happened?" He looked at me, his expression heavy with guilt. "It wasn't like that," he said. "It's more complicated than you think." "Then explain it to me," I said, my voice rising. Because right now, it just looks like you lied to all of us for 20 years. He pulled up an old stool and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Elena and we were together for a short time, he began. It was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt your mother, but it happened. And then Elena got pregnant. I crossed my arms, waiting for him to continue. When she found out, she wanted to keep the baby, he said. But I was still married to your mom. I didn't know what to do. I told Elena I couldn't leave my family, but she refused to give Jake up. She said she'd raise him on her own if she had to. So what changed? I asked. Elena died, he said, his voice breaking slightly. When Jake was just a baby. Car accident. She didn't have any family, no one to take him in. I couldn't just abandon him. Your mom and we decided to raise him as our own. I stared at him, my mind spinning. So Mom knew the whole time? He nodded. She wasn't happy about it. It took years for her to come to terms with it. But we agreed that keeping the truth from you and Jake was the best thing to do. We didn't want him to grow up feeling different. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad had a secret child with another woman, and my mom just went along with it? For years, I'd thought of my parents as this solid, unshakable team. But now it felt like everything I knew about them was a lie. Why didn't you tell us? I asked, my voice trembling. Didn't you think Jake deserved to know the truth? Or me? We thought it would protect you, he said. We didn't want to burden you with something that wasn't your fault. And Jake, he's happy. He has a family. We didn't want to take that away from him. But it's not real, I said, shaking my head. It's all based on a lie. My dad looked at me, his eyes pleading. It's real where it counts, he said. Your mom and I have always loved Jake like he was our own. And we love you. That hasn't changed. I wanted to believe him, but it didn't feel that simple. Does Jake look like her? I asked suddenly. My dad's expression softened. A little, he admitted. He's got her eyes. The image hit me like a punch to the gut. All these years, I'd thought Jake and I were just two halves of the same family, but now I realized there was a whole other part of him I didn't know. Does Jake know? I asked after a long pause. My dad shook his head. No, and I don't want him to. I stared at him in disbelief. You want me to keep this a secret? For his sake, my dad said, and for your mom's. She's been through enough. The weight of what he was asking settled over me like a lead blanket. Keeping this secret wasn't just about protecting Jake. It was about protecting my parents too. But at what cost? What happens if he finds out? I asked. What if someone else tells him? He won't, my dad said firmly. As long as we don't say anything. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My dad had just unloaded this massive, life-altering truth on me and then expected me to keep it locked away forever. It felt impossible. I left the garage without another word, my mind racing. My dad's confession had answered some questions, but it had opened up 100 more. If my mom had agreed to raise Jake as her own, why had she been so scared about me finding out? And why had she said it would tear the family apart if the truth came out now? There was something else, something they weren't telling me, and I was going to find out what it was. I was still trying to process my dad's confession when a notification popped up on my phone. It was a message on Instagram from someone I didn't recognize, a woman named Elena Wilson. At first, I thought it might be a scam or some random spam message. But when I opened it, my heart stopped. Her message read, "Hi, my name? I know this might seem out of the blue, but it's important. I'm Jake's biological mother. Please, can we talk?" I read it over and over, my mind racing. My dad had told me Elena was dead. There was no way this could be real, right? And yet, something about the message sent a chill down my spine. How did she know my name? How did she know about Jake? I didn't reply right away. I needed time to think. My first instinct was to confront my dad, but I knew what he'd say. He'd deny it, try to sweep it under the rug. So instead, I decided to meet her. If this was some kind of scam, I'd figure it out. And if it wasn't, well, I needed answers. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. I got there early and picked a table in the corner, my nerves buzzing like static. A million questions ran through my head. What if she really was Jake's mom? What if she wasn't? Why was she reaching out now? When she walked in, I knew instantly. She looked just like Jake, the same sharp cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes. It was eerie, like seeing an older version of him. "You must be my name," she said, offering a hesitant smile. I nodded, my mouth dry. "You're Elena?" "Yes," she said, sitting across from me. "Thank you for meeting me." She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her hands. but there was a determination in her eyes that made it clear she wasn't going to back down. I don't understand, I said, cutting to the chase. My dad said you. He said you died? Her expression darkened. I figured he might say something like that. But as you can see, I'm very much alive. Why now? I asked. Why are you reaching out after all these years? She took a deep breath. Because Jake deserves to know the truth, she said. It's his right to know where he came from. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The truth. It was the same thing I'd been grappling with ever since I found those letters. But hearing it from her, Jake's biological mother, made it feel even more urgent. I stayed quiet for years, she continued, her voice steady. I didn't want to disrupt his life. When he was a baby, your parents and I came to an agreement. I was young, broke, and scared, and they promised to give him the life I couldn't. But I never stopped thinking about him. And now that he's an adult, I think it's time he knows the truth. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. So you gave him up? It wasn't that simple, she said, her jaw tightening. I didn't have a choice. Your mom made sure of that. Her tone sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean? Elena hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering her voice. Your mom didn't just agree to raise Jake. She threatened me. She told me if I ever came near him again, she'd make my life a living hell. She said I'd already done enough damage to her family. I blinked, stunned. My mom had always been the picture of kindness and grace. It was hard to imagine her saying something like that. That doesn't sound like her, I said, though even as I said it, I remembered the way she'd freaked out when I found the letters. She was different back then, Elena said. Angrier. Bitter. I don't blame her for that. What I did with your dad was wrong. But she didn't just take Jake in out of the kindness of her heart. She wanted to erase me from his life completely. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, her story made sense. My mom had been desperate to protect our family, to keep her marriage intact. But on the other hand, this was my mom we were talking about. Could she really have been that ruthless? Why should I believe you? I asked finally. Elena didn't flinch. I don't expect you to take my word for it, she said. But deep down, I think you already know the truth. You've seen how your mom reacts whenever Jake comes up. She's terrified this will come out. She wasn't wrong. My mom's behavior had been bizarre ever since Jake came home. But still, I felt torn. What do you want from me? I asked. I want to tell Jake, she said simply. But I know it'll be easier coming from someone he trusts. Someone like you. I stared at her, my heart pounding. You want me to tell him? I think he deserves to hear it from family, she said. And I'm not part of that anymore, thanks to your parents. The conversation left me more confused than ever. On the drive home, I kept replaying her words in my head. The way she talked about my mom, the pain in her voice when she mentioned Jake, it all felt real. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that she had her own agenda. When I got home, my mom was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up when I walked in, and for a second, I thought about confronting her right then and there. But I held back. Where were you? She asked, her tone casual. Just out, I said. She nodded, going back to her chopping, but I could feel her watching me out of the corner of her eye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jake, how clueless he was, how much this would destroy him if he found out. Part of me wanted to protect him, to keep the truth buried like my parents had. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that Elena was right. He deserved to know. And then there was my mom. If what Elena said was true, then she wasn't just a victim in all of this. She was part of the reason Jake had been kept in the dark. The thought made my stomach turn. The next morning, I woke up with a decision. I was going to find out the full story. I couldn't take sides until I knew everything. And if my parents weren't going to tell me, I'd have to find another way. I just hoped I wasn't making a mistake. I wasn't planning on confronting my mom that night, but the conversation with Elena had pushed me over the edge. I was tired of feeling like I was walking through a maze of half-truths and secrets, and I needed answers. I found her in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes, her back turned to me. Mom, we need to talk, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She looked over her shoulder, her brow furrowing. Can it wait? No, I interrupted. It can't. She paused, setting the dish down slowly. What's this about? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Elena, I said. Her face went pale in an instant. What about her? I met her, I said bluntly. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles whitening. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I thought she might just walk away like she had before. But then she turned to face me, her expression a mix of fear and anger. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Why not? I snapped. Because I might find out the truth? Her eyes narrowed. The truth? What truth do you think you found? Elena told me everything, I said, pushing forward. She said you threatened her. She said you made her stay away from Jake. At that, something in her broke. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Of course she said that. She's always played the victim. So it's true? I asked, my voice rising. You threatened her? Yes, she said sharply, her eyes flashing. I did. And I'd do it again if I had to. I stared at her, stunned. She didn't even seem ashamed, just angry. Why? I demanded. Why would you do that? Her expression softened slightly, and she sank into a chair at the kitchen table, running a hand through her hair. Because she was trying to take Jake away, she said quietly. What are you talking about? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. After Elena, after your dad brought Jake home, things were hard. Harder than I ever let on. I was still furious at your father, but I loved Jake. He was an innocent baby. He didn't ask for any of this. I tried to make it work for all of us. But I pressed. But then Elena showed up, she said, her voice shaking slightly. She'd been gone for months after Jake was born. No one could find her. And then, suddenly, she came back, claiming she wanted to be part of his life. What's wrong with that? I asked. She was his mom. She wasn't stable. My mom snapped. She'd left him with your father and disappeared. She didn't have a job, a home, anything. And now, all of a sudden, she wanted to waltz back in and play mommy? No. I wasn't going to let her take him away after everything I'd done to keep our family together. I leaned against the counter, trying to process what she was saying. So you threatened her? Yes, she said simply. I told her if she tried to take Jake, I'd make sure she never saw him again. And she backed off. For a while. My mom nodded, her gaze distant. She kept popping up. Letters, phone calls, showing up at your dad's office. It was like she couldn't let it go. Eventually, we had to get a lawyer involved. She finally agreed to give up custody in exchange for some money. She told me you paid her off, I said, my stomach twisting. Call it whatever you want, my mom said, her tone hard. But it worked. Jake got to stay here, with a stable family. And Elena got what she wanted, a fresh start. I stared at her, a million emotions swirling in my chest. Anger, confusion, pity. But one question stood out above all the others. Why didn't you tell us? Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability. Because I wanted to protect you, she said softly. You and Jake. I didn't want you to grow up knowing how messy things really were. I wanted you to feel like we were a normal family. I didn't know whether to believe her. Her words made sense in a twisted way, but they didn't erase what she'd done. Just as I was about to leave, she said something that stopped me in my tracks. Elena and I weren't strangers, you know. I turned back, confused. What do you mean? She let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. She was my best friend, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We grew up together. She was practically family. My jaw dropped. You're kidding. She shook her head. We were inseparable. I introduced her to your father. I trusted her. And then, she betrayed me. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. So Dad cheated on you with your best friend? And she got pregnant? Yes, my mom said, her voice cracking. It destroyed me, but I couldn't walk away. I had you to think about. And when she left Jake behind, I couldn't just let him go. He was innocent in all of this. I sat there in stunned silence. Every time I thought I had the full story, another twist came out of nowhere. Elena wasn't just some random woman my dad had an affair with. She was part of our lives. Someone my mom had trusted. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. So that's why you hate her, I said. I don't hate her, my mom said, wiping her eyes. I hate what she did. I hate what we all did. I didn't know what to say. My entire perspective had shifted again, and I wasn't sure who to believe anymore. Was Elena the victim, as she claimed? Or was my mom right to push her away? All I knew was that the truth was messier than I'd ever imagined, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get to the bottom of it. I had convinced myself I was doing the right thing by not telling Jake about Elena. The truth was messy, painful, and complicated, and no matter how I looked at it, I couldn't see how it would help him. He deserved a shot at a happy, uncomplicated life, even if it meant living in ignorance of the past. But, as it turned out, the decision wasn't mine to make. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. My parents were out, Dad was working late, and Mom had gone to visit a friend. Jake and I were home, caught in our usual post-college routine. Him sprawled out on the couch playing video games, me scrolling mindlessly through my phone. The house felt peaceful for the first time in days, which should have tipped me off that it wouldn't last. The doorbell rang, jolting us both out of our respective bubbles. "Can you get that?" Jake asked, not looking up from his game. "Yeah, sure." I got up, expecting a delivery or maybe one of Jake's old friends stopping by. But when I opened the door, I froze. It was Elena. She looked different this time. Nervous, almost frantic, line and didn't care. Her eyes darted past me into the house, like she was searching for something, or someone. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. "I need to see Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "He has a right to know the truth." "No," I said firmly, my heart racing. "This isn't the time." But she didn't wait for me to finish. She pushed past me and walked into the house. "Who's that?" Jake called from the living room. Before I could stop her, Elena walked in. Jake paused his game and turned to look at her, confusion flashing across his face. "Hi, Jake," she said softly. He glanced at me, his brows furrowed. Who is this?" I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but Elena beat me to it. "I'm your real mom," she said. The room went silent. Jake blinked, his confusion turning to disbelief. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I know this is a lot to take in, but it's the truth. I'm your biological mother. Your dad and we—" "Stop," Jake said sharply, standing up. He turned to me, his face pale. "What is she talking about?" I felt like I was going to throw up. "Jake, You knew," he said, his voice rising. "You knew about this, didn't you?" I couldn't lie. "Yeah," I admitted. "I found out a few weeks ago." His eyes narrowed, hurt and anger swirling in his expression. "And you didn't tell me?" "I was trying to protect you," I said desperately. "I didn't know how to." "You didn't know how to what?" he snapped. "Tell me that my entire life is a lie? That my parents aren't really my parents?" "They are your parents," Elena said quickly. "They raised you, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I'm still your mother, Jake." He stared at her, his jaw clenched. "You're not my mother. You're just some stranger." The argument escalated from there. Elena tried to explain herself, talking about the circumstances that had led her to give up custody. Jake wasn't having it. He accused her of abandoning him, of trying to ruin his life now that he was happy. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice shaking. "And you don't get to just show up and pretend like you care. You left. You made your choice. So why don't you stay gone?" Elena looked devastated, but she didn't back down. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," she said. "Your father and stepmother—" "They're not my step anything," Jake snapped. "They're my real parents. You're just— I don't even know what you are." I tried to intervene, to calm him down, but he wasn't listening to me either. He grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I didn't see Jake for 3 days after that. He didn't answer my texts or calls, and my parents were frantic when they got home and found out what had happened. My mom was furious. "How dare she come into this house and do that?" she raged, pacing the kitchen. "After everything we've done for Jake, after all these years." "She had every right," I said quietly. My mom whipped around to face me. "What did you just say?" "She's his mom," I said, meeting her glare. "You can't expect her to stay away forever." "She signed away her rights," my mom snapped. "She agreed to leave. And now, because of her, Jake is gone. Are you happy?" I didn't answer. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't sorry either. Jake deserved to know the truth, even if it hurt. When Jake finally came home, he was different. Quieter, angrier. He didn't speak to anyone for hours, locking himself in his room and ignoring every attempt to talk to him. When he finally came out, it was to deliver his own bombshell. "I'm done," he said, standing in the middle of the living room. My parents and I stared at him, confused. "Done with what?" my dad asked cautiously. "All of you," Jake said. "This family, this house, this lie. I'm done with it." "Jake, don't say that," my mom said, her voice trembling. "It's true," he said, his expression hard. "You lied to me my entire life. Both of you. And you," he added, looking at me. "You knew and didn't say anything. You're just as bad as they are." "Jake, please," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Too late," he said flatly. What are you saying? My dad asked. I'm saying I'm leaving, Jake said. I don't want anything to do with you. Any of you. He turned and walked out of the house without looking back. The silence that followed was unbearable. My mom collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. My dad looked like someone had punched him in the gut. And me? I just stood there, feeling the weight of everything crashing down around me. Jake was gone, and I didn't know if he'd ever come back. Elena had gotten her wish. Jake knew the truth. But at what cost? The house was eerily quiet after Jake left. My mom had shut herself in her room, crying on and off for hours. My dad wandered around like a ghost, occasionally picking up a newspaper or turning on the TV but never really focusing on anything. And me? I just sat in the living room, staring at the door Jake had walked out of, wondering if he was ever coming back. It felt like the worst had already happened. Jake knew the truth, and now he was gone. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something no one was telling me. And when my dad finally sat down across from me that night, I realized I was right. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I shrugged, not even bothering to hide my frustration. Sure. Why not? Seems like there's always more to say. He winced but didn't argue. It's about Elena, he said. Of course it was. I leaned back, crossing my arms. What about her? She's not here because she cares about Jake, he said, his tone heavy. She wants money. I blinked, caught off guard. Money? What are you talking about? My dad sighed, rubbing his temples like he had a splitting headache. She's been struggling for years. She's tried reaching out before, but this time, she made it clear. She thinks I owe her for what happened with Jake. What do you mean, owe her? She blames me, he said, his voice tight. For everything. For the affair. For the custody agreement. For her life falling apart. She thinks I stole Jake from her, and now she's demanding compensation. I stared at him on what he was saying. So she's blackmailing you? Not exactly, he said. She hasn't made any threats, yet. But she made it clear that if I don't give her what she wants, she'll make things worse for all of us. And after what just happened with Jake, I think she means it. I sat back, stunned. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because it's not your problem, he said firmly. It's mine. And your mother's. She's my brother. I snapped. This whole mess is my problem. My dad hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Fair enough. The revelation made me look at everything differently. If Elena was only here because she wanted money, how much of what she told me was true? Was she really trying to reconnect with Jake? Or was that just a cover for her real motives? And what about my mom? Had she really been trying to protect Jake? Or had she gone too far in trying to keep Elena out of the picture? I decided to dig deeper. My dad had kept enough secrets from me, and I wasn't going to let him brush this off like it didn't matter. The next day, while my parents were out, I went through my dad's office. It felt wrong, but I didn't care. If Elena was blackmailing him, or planning to, I needed to know the truth. I found what I was looking for in a locked drawer in his desk. The key was hidden in the back of a filing cabinet, like he thought no one would ever go looking. Inside the drawer were a few old legal documents, along with a stack of letters from Elena. The letters were different from the ones I'd found in the attic. These weren't love letters. They were angry, desperate pleas. David, you can't ignore me forever. I'm Jake's mother. I have a right to see him. You think money can fix everything, but it can't. You stole my son from me, and you're going to pay for it. One way or another. I'm not asking for much. Just enough to get back on my feet. But if you keep shutting me out, I'll have no choice but to go to Jake myself. The last letter was dated just a few weeks ago, and it was the most chilling of all. I've stayed quiet for 21 years, but I'm done being the villain in your story. Jake deserves to know the truth. If you won't tell him, I will. I sat there, holding the letters, feeling like I was seeing Elena for the first time. She wasn't the heartbroken mother she'd made herself out to be when we met. She was bitter, angry, and clearly willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. But the more I read, the more conflicted I felt. Was she wrong to want money after everything that had happened? My dad had admitted to having an affair with her, to getting her pregnant and then leaving her to raise Jake alone, at least for a while. And my mom had admitted to threatening her, to cutting her out of Jake's life completely. Maybe Elena wasn't lying about everything. Maybe my mom and dad weren't the heroes of this story either. That night, I confronted my dad again. I found the letters, I said. His face tightened. I told you to leave this alone. And I told you I wasn't going to. I shot back. So is it true? Did you and Mom really pay Elena to give up Jake? Yes, he said reluctantly. But it wasn't like that. She agreed to the arrangement. We didn't force her. You didn't have to force her, I said bitterly. Mom already scared her into thinking she didn't have a choice. He winced but didn't deny it. We did what we thought was best for Jake. And what about Elena? I asked. What about what was best for her? He sighed. She made her choices, just like we made ours. The more I talked to my dad, the more I realized that no one in this situation was blameless. Elena had made mistakes, disappearing after Jake was born, coming back only when it suited her. But my parents had made their own mistakes too, and they'd spent the last 2 decades trying to cover them up. By the time I went to bed, my head was spinning. I didn't know who to believe anymore, or whose side to take. All I knew was that the truth wasn't as simple as any of them had made it out to be. The next day, I decided to track Jake down. He hadn't answered my calls or texts, but I knew where he liked to go when he needed space. There was a park near our old high school, a quiet spot where he used to hang out with his friends. Sure enough, I found him there, sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. "Hey," I said, sitting down next to him. He didn't look at me. "What do you want?" "I just want to talk," I said. "About everything." "There's nothing to talk about," he said flatly. "Jake," I said gently, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But this isn't as black and white as it seems." He looked at me then, his eyes full of pain. "How can you defend them after what they did?" "I'm not defending anyone," I said. I think you deserve to know the whole story, not just their side, or Elena's. All of it." He didn't say anything, but he didn't walk away either. It was a start. After Jake and I talked at the park, I thought maybe, just maybe, things could start to settle down. I told him what I knew, laid out the messy truth about Elena and my parents as best as I could. He didn't say much during the conversation, just nodded occasionally, his expression unreadable. But when we parted ways, I felt like we'd at least made progress. I was wrong. Jake wasn't interested in moving forward. He wanted answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he had them all. A few days later, he called me out of the blue. "I hired a lawyer," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "A lawyer?" I repeated, caught off guard. "For what?" "To look into the custody arrangement," he said. "The deal Elena made with Mom and Dad. I need to know what really happened." I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I understood why he was doing it. He'd been lied to his whole life, and he deserved the truth. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to rip our family apart even more. The investigation didn't take long. Within a week, Jake had documents in hand, copies of the legal agreements my parents and Elena had signed all those years ago. He showed up at the house late one evening, clutching a manila folder. "Jake," my mom said, standing in the doorway, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, brushing past her and into the living room. My dad and I followed, both of us tense. Jake sat down on the couch, dropped the folder on the coffee table, and looked at my parents like they were strangers. "Care to explain this?" he said, his voice cold. My mom's hands were shaking as she picked up the folder. She flipped through the documents, her eyes widening. My dad leaned over her shoulder, his expression grim. "What did you find?" I asked, breaking the silence. Jake didn't look at me. "The truth," he said bitterly. The documents painted a picture that was both clearer and uglier than I'd imagined. Back when Jake was a baby, Elena had tried to fight for custody. She hadn't just walked away like my parents had claimed. She wanted to be part of Jake's life. But my mom and dad hadn't been willing to share. The court battle had been short-lived, though. Before it could escalate, my mom made Elena an offer. A large sum of money in exchange for full custody of Jake. The terms were brutal. Elena would forfeit all parental rights, agree to stay out of Jake's life, and never contact him or my parents again. And she'd taken the deal. "I thought you threatened her," Jake said, his voice shaking as he glared at my mom. "But this wasn't a threat. It was a bribe." "Jake, please," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that. We were trying to protect you." "Protect me?" he snapped. "You paid my mother to walk away. Do you know how messed up that is?" My dad tried to step in. "Jake, we thought it was the best thing for you. Elena wasn't in a good place." "Don't," Jake interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don't make this about her. She might have taken the money, but you're the ones who offered it." The room was suffocatingly silent. My mom looked like she wanted to crawl into a hole. My dad was clenching his fists, his jaw tight. And Jake, I'd never seen him like this. He wasn't just angry, he was broken. "You lied to me," he said, his voice cracking. "My whole life, you lied to me. And it wasn't just about where I came from. You lied about who you are. You made me think we were this perfect family, but it was all fake. It wasn't fake, my mom said desperately. We loved you. You loved me. He cut her off, laughing bitterly. You loved me so much you didn't think I deserved to know the truth about my own life? I wanted to say something, to defend my parents or comfort Jake, or maybe just scream, but I was frozen. Jake's next words hit like a bombshell. I'm done, he said, standing up. My mom looked up at him, her face crumpling. What do you mean, done? I mean I'm done with this family, he said. With all of you. I can't be here anymore. Jake, please, my dad said, his voice unsteady. We can fix this. No, you can't, Jake said sharply. You can't fix 21 years of lies. He grabbed the folder and walked to the door. Where are you going? I asked, finally finding my voice. Away, he said, not looking back. Don't try to find me. After he left, my mom broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. My dad just sat there, staring at the empty doorway like Jake might walk back in at any moment. And me? I felt numb. I wanted to blame Elena for all of this, for coming back into our lives and stirring up old wounds. But the truth was, this wasn't her fault. My parents had made their choices, and now we were all paying the price. Over the next few weeks, the house felt emptier than ever. Jake didn't call or text, and every attempt to reach him went unanswered. My parents started arguing more. Quiet, tense fights that always ended with one of them storming out of the room. And me? I didn't know whose side to take. My mom had done terrible things, but she'd done them out of love. My dad had lied, but he'd also been trying to protect us. And Elena, she wasn't the monster my mom had made her out to be, but she wasn't innocent either. All I knew was that our family was shattered, and there was no putting it back together. The last time I saw Jake was a few months later. He showed up at my apartment unexpectedly, looking thinner and more tired than I'd ever seen him. I'm moving, he said, his voice hollow. Where? I asked. Does it matter? I wanted to tell him it did, that I cared, that I didn't want to lose him. But the words wouldn't come. I just thought you should know, he said. Jake, I said, my voice trembling. I'm sorry. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Me too. And then he was gone. My family hasn't been the same since. My parents barely talk to each other anymore, and I don't talk to either of them as much as I used to. Elena hasn't reached out again, but I think about her sometimes, wondering if she got what she wanted, or if she's as lost as the rest of us. As for Jake, I don't know if I'll ever see him again. But wherever he is, I hope he's found the peace we never could.